Hi, everyone. I'm Alyssa Grimshaw, our biomedical research and methodology librarian here at the Yale Harvey Cushing John Hay Whitney Medical Library. Today, we're going to go through a lecture that is the blueprint for evidence, protocol writing for systematic and scoping reviews. Our learning objectives for this session is by the end of the session, you'll be able to describe the purpose and the value of protocols in evidence synthesis, differentiate between systematic and scoping review protocols, identify key protocol elements using Prisma P or JBI, also locate and evaluate protocol registries, whether that is Prospero, Open Science Framework, or journals. If you are looking for a more hands-on version of this class, I recommend that you attend our protocol workshop, where we go over some of these very abridged information. So I do recommend that you attend both. And then we draft and refine a preliminary protocol outline together. So that's working through your question, your criteria as a group. Okay, so I always like to start these by just quickly going over library resources and services related to evidence synthesis. Essentially, our model is that the librarian can be a consultant. So that could be answering questions, providing methods help, reviewing your search strategy and giving you feedback, reviewing your protocol and giving you feedback. And these are more of like a question and answer based situations. So, as a consultant, we wouldn't do the work for you. We are providing you information to be able to do the work yourself. Alternatively, we also have the librarian as a co author model, and this is where the librarian becomes embedded in your research team. We provide feedback on your protocol. We do all of the search drafting and execution across multiple databases. We deduplicate the results, put the results up in Confidence, and then we do some of the manuscript development by describing the methodology that we've done, providing the search log, and there is some additional support that you can get from library staff in terms of uploading the PDFs. So to request collaboration from the library, you want to fill out the form, and I'll make sure that everyone has a copy of my slides after this class, or if you're watching it asynchronously, they are up on that same LibGuide where you link to this class information. The library also has some tools that you can use. So EndNote is the citation management software that I use for my systematic reviews. You can, of course, use any of the other citation management tools like Zotero, and it has the same functionality. It's just a software preference. But Yale does provide access to EndNote. Alternatively, or in addition to, I should say, we also have access to Confidence. Confidence is a screening, kind of like a project management tool that can do screening. You can do data extraction within Confidence, risk of bias. So that is something that could make your systematic review or scoping review project a little more streamlined and easier to run. For more information about how you can request either librarian collaboration or some of our resources, please find these two links below that have more detailed information. Okay, so let's just dive right into why you guys are really here. Before you're diving into the databases and pulling articles, the very first step in a systematic or scoping review is writing a protocol. Think of this as your blueprint. It tells you what you're building and how you're planning on building it. Protocols bring transparency, consistency to the process. They force you to lay out your plan clearly before you start, which reduces the chance of bias creeping in later when you're tempted to make decisions based on what you're finding. They also add to your project's credibility. When you publish a review, the readers, journal editors, even the peer reviewers want to know that you didn't make up the methods halfway through and you clearly defined them early and applied them to all of the records that you were looking at. Having a protocol demonstrates that you had a clear plan from the beginning, which is so important in this review type. which is another reason why protocol matters. They help prevent duplication of effort. If someone else is already doing the same exact review, their protocol is registered in Prospero or Open Science Framework, or they published a protocol paper, and you can see it early on and decide whether or not you want to reframe your research question or the scope of your project, or reach out to see if they're still looking for collaborators. And finally, protocols are not just nice to have anymore. Increasingly, journals and registries require them. For example, BMJ won't accept a review manuscript unless you have a published protocol. It is an instant desk rejection. You don't even get to an editor or a peer reviewer to comment on the fact that you don't have a protocol. It doesn't even make it that far. So, by writing one early, you set yourself up for a smooth publication process later. It's a very important part of the systematic or scoping review methodology and workflow. So now that you know why it's important, we need to know what it is, right? A protocol is essentially your game plan for conducting a review. It describes in advance what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, and why you've chosen those methods. This is especially important if you have deviated from typical methodology, and so you would want to describe it in your method. So, for instance, if you were doing single screen, this would be very important to note so that way people understand your methodology that you're taking to this project. Although I would argue if you're doing single screen, you're probably doing a rapid review and not a systematic or scoping. You want to think of the protocol as the roadmap or the blueprint. It guides the team and keeps everyone aligned. It also helps you keep track of everything and prevents mid-project scope creep. So there's nothing that can be a surprise because it's all in your protocol. Writing a protocol helps avoid any mid-project changes that could introduce bias or make your results less reliable. Importantly, protocols also support reproducibility, so other researchers can understand and replicate your process. Having a documented plan hopefully protects you against questions later like, why did you exclude these studies? Or why did you include this method? Finally, many journal funders expect a protocol. It's an important part of the professional standard of an evidence synthesis. Okay, so when we're thinking about systematic versus scoping review, and so these could also be described not only in the protocol, but also the actual written review too. But systematic review protocols are designed to answer a narrow, clearly defined question. They emphasize bias and often include the possibility of a meta analysis. Their objectives are very specific and very measurable. Scoping review protocols, on the other hand, they have a broader focus, just like the review type that they are covering. They explore wide ranging or exploratory questions with the main emphasis on mapping the existing evidence, identifying those gaps in evidence. Their objectives are less about measuring outcomes and more about providing a broad overview of what's known and what's missing. So your synthesis will generally have less of these specific measurable outcomes and analysis, and it'll be more open ended. Despite the differences between these two review types and their protocols, both approaches share some very important features. They require clear objectives, transparent methods, and structured reporting. These shared characteristics are what make them rigorous and reproducible forms of evidence synthesis. So it's important to think about, when does your protocol need to be registered? So the gold standard is before the start of the review. Protocol registry should occur prior to study selection and data extraction. Now, this is gold standard, right? Prospero will not accept your registration if you've started data extraction, but you can do study screening and selection. So as long as you have not extracted data, Prospero will still accept it. Open Science Framework, on the other hand, will allow you to disclose where in the process you are, and they will not reject your paper just based on the fact that it wasn't published a priori. That being said, It will be disclosed on the website and you may be questioned as to why you didn't register it earlier in line with the gold standard, which is Prospero in terms of before data extraction. Now, um, protocol updates should be done after registration for any changes that are being made to your protocol or your study design. And these should be documented clearly with an amendment defining the change and when it was taking place and your justification for that change. So important to note that once you register that protocol, any changes do need to be documented. Okay, there are lots of different protocol templates that you can work with. Prisma P, I think, is my personal preference. It is Prisma for protocols. I have adapted the Prisma P to be aligned for scoping reviews too. Feel free to download my templates on the LibGuide where you find this class recording. There's also the templates that are within Prospero, also Open Science Framework, or the JBI Scoping Review template. I will add a caveat to this, where recently Prospero in March of 2025 did update their website, and this new website does say that their registration form is just that, just a registration form, and that you should be uploading a full protocol along with your registration. And so this is very clear on their website. So I do now totally recommend for teams using Prospero, Prisma P, and having a full protocol that you can upload with that information. Okay, so let's talk about the key protocol elements, and this is across several different protocol templates, and I've combined them to create the core components. So they're listed here, but I'll dive right into the specifics. So first, we're going to look at background and rationale. The background is a brief overview of the clinical, scientific, or public health context. It also provides information on why the topic matters, whether that's burden of disease, the knowledge gap, the policy relevance, the clinical relevance, but the why is really important. It also provides a brief summary of evidence, so what's currently known, and then a gap in identification, so what needs to be known. And then there's a justification for the review. I just always like to highlight this for teams that this isn't your entire introduction for your paper. So it's okay for this to be brief as long as you're fairly detailed and descriptive in the information that's provided and you're really explaining the importance of why and the justification for why this review is needed and the gap. Okay, so the next thing that you would want to consider or look at is the objectives in the research question. So for this, you want a clearly articulated statement of what the review aims to achieve. And you want to link the objectives to the gaps that you identified in your background. Sometimes it's helpful for you to tie these rationale statements to your research question framework. And there's lots of different frameworks. I'm sure that there's a framework for your question. So if you're struggling to find the appropriate framework, please feel free to reach out to the librarians here. We'd love to talk to you about your framework and your research question and what framework would work best. But PICO or PICO might be one that would be helpful. Spider, Finer, it just depends on how we're breaking down your research question. Okay, so next we have the inclusion exclusion criteria. And I would say this is probably one of the most important sections that you're going to fill out. So it's really important that you're thinking about this fully as you are filling it out and not just rushing through it. So this is how we are defining the rules for the review. And we're going to specify exactly how you'll decide on which studies to include or exclude. And this ensures that the rules are transparent and reproducible for anyone that is looking at your inclusion exclusion criteria. So a lot of the inclusion exclusion criteria is going to be based off of your research question, and it might include your PICO or PICO elements. Your criteria should directly reflect your review objectives. So if your review is based on people that are struggling with substance abuse disorder, that's going to be your population. And so, people that are not struggling from substance use disorder would be your exclusion criteria. So if there's no proper population that fits your inclusion criteria, it would be an exclusion reason. Essentially, you want to identify study characteristics. So, for instance, you may limit to certain study designs. So, if you are looking for RCTs, you may want to limit your search and your inclusion exclusion criteria to just RCTs. Generally, I wouldn't recommend just RCTs. I feel like observational studies do add an important element to the review. But it really depends on your research question and what your analysis and your sub-analysis are. So this may be something that you want to review again at the end after you've completed filling out your protocol, just to make sure that your protocol does properly align, your inclusion exclusion criteria does properly align with the rest of your protocol. You may want to also include population characteristics. So, are we only including children or only adults? Healthcare status or location. So, if you're doing a question where the population of interest are on Medicare or Medicaid, it wouldn't make sense to search the global world. You'd want to limit to only the United States. It might be types of interventions or exposures or outcomes. So, is there a particular drug that you're looking as the intervention? Are we looking for exposures where people had some sort of like occupational health exposure? It really depends on what your research question is. We also might want to consider a time frame or publication date. It is extremely important that we're very careful in how we are considering this. Technically, this could be a study limitation. It could change your review type from systematic or scoping to a rapid review because you're not looking at the totality of the evidence. Essentially, the only reason you would want to add a time frame or publication date is if there was a major change and everything earlier is no longer relevant. So, new drug to market, the standard of treatment previously was a different drug, and now all new publications are no longer relevant. If you're including that drug in your search strategy, you actually don't need to include a date because we already have that limitation. But if you're just, looking at, heart attack and death, and there's a new drug that, is better and saves more lives, and all the earlier drugs are no longer being used, then potentially, if you're looking at heart attack outcomes and you're not scoping it in terms of the intervention, that potentially you may want to include a date limitation. Very, very important that you are thinking about these dates, you have a justification that you can provide to the peer reviewers, and that you're clearly explaining why you chose this criteria. Again, just being like, I only wanted X a number of years, or, it's so many results, I don't want to handle that many, not a reason in this type of study design. Other considerations for your inclusion and exclusion criteria, language or accessibility restrictions. So, what are you going to do if, um, it is not something available at Yale, or isn't a language that no of the review team reads? I would recommend that you at least keep them in the search, and if you're going to eliminate based on these reasons, to exclude at full text review so that you're disclosing how big of a study limitation you have. But something to consider, again, could make it into your inclusion exclusion criteria, not necessarily something that should make it into your search criteria. There might be other context specific factors that might influence eligibility. Sometimes I see teams where they're saying, like, I'm not limiting by study design, but we need at least 10 patients for it to be included. Again, we want to be able to defend the reason and the amount. And so you may want to look in the field that you're publishing in to ensure that you're aligned with the norms. Okay, so pro tips related to inclusion and exclusion criteria. Your inclusion exclusion criteria is not always reflected in your search strategy. I know I said that, but I just want to say it one more time so that everyone really hears it. Some of your inclusion criteria may be study limitations, like I said, with that date limitation, the language limitation. If your team doesn't plan on ordering papers through ILL or emailing authors or hunting down papers that might be hard to find. Again, for some of those, I think that that would actually reclassify your review as a rapid review, but that's something you'll want to really assess. And the librarians here are happy to talk you through those methodology questions. Addition to this, you may have broader inclusion exclusion criteria for title and abstract screening and narrower for full text review screening. So, if you're searching by an outcome, so for instance, we're going back to my heart attack question, it may be that I'm really looking at the change in death. And it could be, I want to compare, has this new drug really made all these improvements that I'm saying it does? Or is it, more similar than the treatments that we're giving previously? I might not see death counts actually described in the title and abstract, right? Title and abstracts are very precise summaries that oftentimes you don't get to put all of your outputs, especially outcomes, especially if you're, you have several different outcomes. So it might be that I want to look at all of those papers describing patients that are on that new drug and are hospitalized, or I believe might have a report of who survived and who died. So, you want to think about what is something you're going to look at in title and abstract screening and what you're going to look at in full text review screening. Okay, so now that we have our inclusion exclusion criteria, we can think about our search. And like I said, I don't think that you can think about your search until we have defined inclusion exclusion criteria. That is our most important step that needs to be done before we do anything else. We want to think about the databases that you want to search, and you want to list all the databases that you're planning on searching. You also want to think about gray literature. So how are you going to handle trial registries? What if there's no data available yet? Are you going to exclude them? Are you going to come back and do a search update right before you publish to ensure that that data hasn't been published yet? How are you going to handle conference abstracts? Abstracts per methodology are supposed to be included. If you are studying something that is really new, so what if we're looking at AI interventions for heart attacks? If all of the papers are currently still pending peer review to get published and everything available is conference abstracts, and say we have 20 studies, 18 of them are conference abstracts, 2 have been published in full text. That's really not giving us a synthesis that we can make a generalization on, because most of the studies have a publication bias, and we don't have that information. So if that's kind of like what you're going with, how are you going to deal with the missing data? Are you going to reach out to authors? What is our game plan here? Like I said, conference abstracts per Cochrane, they're supposed to be included, and you're supposed to reach out to the authors for the gold standard. Now, gold standard versus realistic standard, I would say lots of reviews get published excluding conference abstracts. There's lots of meta science that show conference abstracts change significantly one way or the other between the time the conference abstract is published and when the full text is published of the paper. So that's all things that you want to consider and discuss as a research team as to what you're going to include or exclude, and it needs to make it into the inclusion exclusion criteria. You also want to think about dissertations, government reports, organizational reports. What information is necessary for you to include, and how are we going to find that information? We also want to think about other sources for finding material outside of the database searches. So this is really, really important because the databases, they often have a Western focus. We may be missing some of the literature. Things might not be well described, and our search might not retrieve them. So it could be really important to think about backwards and forward citation chasing, expert consultation. So, are you going to ask the experts if something was missed or if they know of any other studies or any unpublished studies? How are you going to deal with preprints? Preprints are significantly more popular now. And would you exclude them? Would you include them? How is that going to work for your review? Then you want to document the search strategy. And so I generally have a preliminary search strategy that I include in all of my protocols. But you could potentially include your full record or your search log in the protocol too. And it's important when you're documenting the search strategy, you are getting all of the information directly from the database as it's searched. So if you are doing this search in PubMed, make sure that you go into the advanced search, click the downward arrow, and instead of inputting whatever thing that you put into the search box, you are taking the actual translated search that the automated mapping did in PubMed. So super important. And don't rely on automating mapping. So you should definitely be structuring a search. But just in case, make sure you click the advanced search. Okay, so we want to define keywords and controlled vocabulary for each of the concepts. So super exhaustive list of everything that could describe the terms that you're looking at. This is especially important if you've got it. We call them fuzzy searches here in the library, but like social determinants of health, things like social support. And it's really important that you define these in the protocol too. So I had one team that they were doing an implementation science paper, and they were looking for papers that were implementation science. And so they were using the official definition of that. And so I think it was on the NIH website at the time. I'm dating myself, it was kind of an older review. But because we had it clearly defined, we could make a much more precise search. If I had to describe any way that implementation science was being described, they would have had to look at tens or 20,000 papers, and that just wasn't in the capacity of the team. So better defining all of these characteristics or concepts that you're looking at can be really important. We want to specify the Boolean logic and how we're going to apply those to the search, any truncation that we're going to do on our keywords, and any proximity operators that we're searching. In terms of methodology related to this, it's also really important to describe your methodology. So, the databases that you're searching, but also, will you have someone peer review your search? Per Cochrane, it is best practice to have someone else peer review your search. We don't need two people to actually do the search. It can be done by just one person. You're inputting it in the databases, extracting all of the citations retrieved. So it doesn't need to have multiple people doing the same thing. That would just be creating a lot of duplicates. But someone else should review your search. Ideally, this should be done both by someone that's familiar with the taxonomy and indexing within the databases and has a better idea of how they work, so that way they can steer you in the right direction if there's some problematic parts of your search. But it should also be done by a subject content expert. So whether that's I developed the search and the first author that's working with me more closely, and I discuss the search strategy, or maybe the PI looks at it after you review it. But we want someone with subject content expert to make sure we haven't added too many search terms, or more importantly, we haven't missed out on any search terms. So I definitely recommend that you get your search peer reviewed. It's a very important part of the process. Okay, so just to shift gears a little bit, we also want to talk about our study selection process. So we may define screening steps in title and abstract screening, and then also needs to be done again in full text screening. And I realize most of the time this language looks like title and abstract screening was done by two independent reviewers, and conflicts will be resolved by a third reviewer. blah, blah, blah. Full text review was done by the same two independent screeners that were blinded, and conflicts were resolved with a third screener. It's just really important that each step you define exactly how you did this. Um, and in terms of who screens, the standard is two. So if you're doing one, like I said, I think you're more doing a rapid review. We want to talk about the methodology. But if you're doing multiple reviewers, or maybe you're doing a pilot study and you also want to describe that, all of the reviewers were trained on the same, 200 articles and title and abstract screening, and you met the goal was an inter-rater reliability of X amount. That's also something you could describe. And it's important to describe. Also, you want to define how conflicts will be resolved. Like we said, this could be discussion or a third reviewer. It's important to note here, and I think it's like kind of confusing because my assumption would be the opposite. So I just want to, put this out there for everybody. The gold standard is actually the third independent reviewer going and looking at this. Now, I feel like on reviews where we didn't have a third reviewer and instead, the team met once a week and we resolved all the conflicts, the discussions were actually very helpful. And people were very passionate and wanted to move the research that they identified to the next round. So I think it's a more robust methodology. But that's my personal opinion, and I'm not the one that makes the rules. I'm just telling you about them. Just keeping that in mind. Third reviewer is the gold standard. Group discussion is acceptable practice, but third review is really the preferred one. Okay, so in this section, we also want to include screening software. So state what software or tools will be used. We're documenting the entire process. So if we're using, like I mentioned, we may have a little more narrow exclusion reasons at full text review. Generally, you want to document both of them in the protocol, but the list of exclusions at full text review stage is generally what's going to make it into your manuscript, because there's not a lot of space, so you probably don't have space to describe both of them, and they're the more narrowly focused one. But it is okay that they are slightly different. They can't be totally different. We definitely want full text review to be a narrower focus of those title and abstract reasons. But it's okay if they're slightly different or you apply them slightly different between the two stages. Also, important to note here, the exclusion reasons at full text review, you may want to also list the actual exclusion reasons you plan on using. At full text review, when you eliminate a paper, you do need to give the actual reason for exclusion. So both of those are very important. Okay, so now we have our review articles. Maybe we've done citation chasing. That would be great. And then we have all of our included studies. Maybe we haven't. I don't know. There's other steps that aren't being described here. We're only describing the stuff for the protocol, right? So if we talk about data extraction and synthesis methods. Now, I think that this is the hardest thing to fill out. At least in my opinion, it's the hardest thing to fill out in terms of the protocol, because you're using found data, right? So it's not something that you're generating yourself. You're relying on what other people have reported in their paper. So there's, the method reporting for this. So who's doing the data extraction, the number of reviewers, is it independent, is it paired? How are disagreements going to be resolved? What software are you using to do this? Do you do it in Excel, Google Form, Google Sheets, Confidence, RedCap, etc.? And you want to also clearly describe how the data will be extracted. But the harder part is what information will be extracted, right? So we want to think, I tell teams, like, you really want to think about the paragraphs that you plan on writing that are going to tell the story that you're interested in telling. And then also, what do you need to put in table 1? So your data extraction form really you should have at least a very good rough draft before you start your research project. But you may need to add or edit or adjust again, you're using found data. You might find very interesting things that are relevant and you would like to report on. And so that's totally fine. If you've registered your protocol, you want to go back. If you adjust your data extraction form and write an amendment, date it. Why did you make this adjustment? Found an interesting thing. I had a team once that was doing a scoping review, and they were really interested in transgendered health and sexual health. So, we did all of the search strategies and stuff like that, and, how they were planning, reproductive health as transitioning. And one important thing that we didn't include in the original search was in relation to cancer. So there was a lot of like fertility preservation efforts related to cancer that wasn't something that we were really thinking about. So we actually went in, made an amendment, and added to our search strategy and then the data extraction forms this additional information related to cancer preservation, reproductive health preservation related to cancer. So that was just like really interesting. And sometimes that happens. And it happens. You're using found data. It's not as predictable. But you also want to specify all the descriptive statistics that you're doing. So any tables, charts, narrative synthesis, your meta-analysis approach if applicable. So effects measures, model types, your plan for assessment of heterogeneity, any plan for subgroup or sensitivity analysis that you might undertake. Really important to note. So, I don't know if you've attended our other classes, but definitely look at our dipping your toes into evidence synthesis. If you're not sure if you're writing a scoping or a systematic review, one thing I would really recommend, especially as you're getting into the nitty gritty of your protocol, is that if you look at SWIM, which is synthesis without meta analysis, which is one of the reporting guidelines, it's essentially what you add on to Prisma if you're not doing a meta analysis. If you are unable to fill out SWIM, you are probably doing a scoping review. And that's okay. Scoping reviews are really rigorous and important parts of our evidence pyramid. It just might not be a systematic review. So if that is something that you're still considering, and as I'm going through these, you're like, I don't know how I would assess heterogeneity. That's not something I want to address. Take a look at SWIM. If you can fill out SWIM, you are doing a systematic review. If you can't, maybe we need to consider other options. Okay, so I also want to highlight this because I think that this is one of the most important parts of the systematic review, but it is also frequently one of the parts that is least done. Your risk of bias and your quality assessment is seriously so important, and I don't believe that these study designs should potentially be published without it. That being said, there are instances where study design of your review or your review question could be a little difficult to do these. So for instance, I have a scoping review on the participation in RCTs as a inpatient, like as a hospitalized patient. And so a lot of the included studies, because we were looking at like why people refuse, a lot of the studies were actually fake studies. So they just approached the patient, said, hey, do you want to participate in this study? But there was no actual study. So these mock trials, which is a really poor way to describe these, but there's no risk of bias assessment tool on mock trials. So being able to properly assess the methodological quality and rigor of a study where there's no tool for it can be really difficult. So for instance, that one we didn't do it, but for most, I actually really do recommend it. And why I recommend that is this is a synthesis, right? So we're making recommendations, especially systematic reviews, that your paper is going to make a recommendation. There we've synthesized this information of the included studies, and we've made it into a place where the readers probably are not going to go to the original study and be able to assess the quality for themselves. So, because we're synthesizing and making a recommendation, it is really, really important that risk of bias and quality assessment is done because it helps interpret the results and gives the reader confidence in the readings. If you are reading your like a systematic review and there is no risk of bias assessment, you should not trust the results. And like maybe you can think about how much you would have confidence in their findings if you have no idea. So, for instance, we're looking at a study, all of the outcomes are very positive. We're like, wow, this is going to be a great intervention. Look at this meta analysis. It's really showing an improvement in mortality or quality of life or whatever our improvement measure is, right? And then we find out all of the underlining studies were funded by pharma. And it's like, how much can we trust those findings? So we don't know if we can trust them. And so also, a big part of this risk of bias quality assessment is to look at the funding information and see if there's any conflicts of interest in the underlining studies and then disclosing that. Okay, so just to shift focus, for the tools and the criteria for this is that you want to specify a tool that you'll use. So that could be generally Cochrane is seen as the gold standard. Whether their tool is better or worse than another one, I will allow you guys to make that assessment. But we have Cochrane risk of bias or our Rob 2, and then we have Robbins I, and now there's Robbins E. So Rob 2 is for RCTs. Robbins I or E is for intervention or exposure studies. So depending on what observational studies you're including, if they're an intervention or exposure, that might be appropriate. There's also Newcastle Ottawa Scale, which does cohort and case control studies, JBI critical appraisal tools, which has a whole suite for a whole bunch of different study designs. I point this out because they have one for cross-sectional studies. NIH also has one for cross-sectional studies. For the cross-sectional studies, it's specifically important to think about the type of cross-sectional study you're including because each tool kind of does a little bit of a different thing and it judges slightly different things for those. So like I think the JBI one is specifically on prevalence. So if you're, looking at prevalence studies, that could be more relevant. Then there's also like specific tools. So there's ones that are not really looking at your study design of the included studies. They're more looking at like diagnostic accuracy or, this or that. So depending on what your research question, your tool the recommended tool may be a little different. And so you want to really think through what's the most appropriate tool for you. Then this is so important. And I think most teams skip this step is like go look at the tool, especially if you're not familiar with it. So if there's some kind of criteria that needs to be defined in the domains, such as selection, performance, detection, reporting, any of that stuff, this should be defined in your protocol. This shouldn't be like you guys are sitting together, you've done risk of bias, you guys all have this one paper that's super frustrating, and you're like, well, it says it's generalizable, but I'm looking at it and, this population is super small. I don't know that it's as generalizable as we're saying it is. You want to define this early. So look at those domains and then address anything that leaves some interpretation in what you think you'll be doing. Obviously, I realize this is, again, very difficult to do when you're not actually looking at the papers and have a strong idea of what's included in your review. Again, who will assess this? Typically, everything with systematic review, I mean, again, except for the search, is two independent reviewers that are doing this assessment or extractors, whatever you want to call them. And then any methods for resolving disagreement. So again, whether this is discussion or a third reviewer. Also, super important is how you plan on dealing with this data, right? So if you have 3 studies that have super high risk of bias, you're just looking at them and you're like, wow, I like the data behind this is great, but their methodological rigor was horrible. The quality of this paper is the worst, right? What are you going to do in that instance? Do you exclude? Do you disclose? What's your game plan? Then you also want to think about planning for potential like sensitivity analysis related to this. So do you want to exclude the high risk studies and rerun the analysis and see how that changes? And so this is really transparent and potentially will give the readers more confidence. So if there's really too high risk studies and you're looking at it and you rerun your analysis excluding those, does the results change? If it doesn't, like maybe you can trust it a little more, right? Okay, shift focus again. There's also a section in the registration that talks about your registration and dissemination plan. So really meta here, right? So you want to state where your protocol will be registered. So it's really important. Not only did you write the protocol and you made your blueprint and your plan of what needs to your action plan, but where are you going to make it publicly available? You may want to include a registration date and any planned updates. And depending on when you are publishing this, the earlier in the process, the better. So you may want to, remind the reader of exactly when you plan on doing this. And earlier before study selection, again, ensures transparency and reduces bias. So we should all hope that we meet that deadline. And then in terms of dissemination plan, you might have a strong idea already of like what journals you want to submit to, if there's any conference presentations, etc. I generally keep the sentence kind of broad just because I don't want, the journal to know I shopped it around a little bit if we got rejected. But you can be as transparent as you would like. And then you also want to consider how you're going to report this to stakeholders, policymakers, or patient communities if relevant. I do want to add here, especially because we're talking about patient communities, that this study design, it's actually best practice to include a patient advocate or a patient on the review and have them be an important and integral part of the process. So while you're thinking about, your protocol, your research team, you may want to think, is this a good paper that I should include a patient advocate or a consumer health representative here? Because, they may also have ways to make this research also important to the community that you're looking at. And I would say, I just published my 100th review a few weeks ago, and very few of my reviews have patient advocates or patients on them. So that is definitely something that we should, as researchers, consider an attempt to expand. Okay, so now we've gone over what a protocol is, what's in a protocol. We really want to think about the planning for writing our protocol, right? So there's a lot of sections and you need to do a lot of work for those sections. First, I think it's important to review what's already been done, right? So, you have this grand idea, but has someone else already had this idea and did they beat you to publication, right? So I recommend that you run a search in PubMed or another database of your choice and limit it to reviews. I will say that scoping reviews are frequently missed, indexed or titled as systematic reviews. So I would search for this both scoping and systematic to just firmly understand what the high level evidence synthesis information is available. But we can do a very precise search for your concepts or your research question, put it into PubMed, and then do a title search for scoping and systematic reviews and limit it to those. It's also helpful if you search protocol in this, or you don't eliminate protocol, I should say, because that can be helpful for kind of our next check, right? So two birds, one stone. Okay, so next we're going to check for existing protocols on the same or similar topics. This is not as easy as finding previously published reviews, right? Because the protocols are in a bunch of different places. First, I recommend that you start at TRIP, which is Turning Research into Practice. TRIP is a free database, and it is the only database that I'm aware of that allows you to search the entire Prospero registry. This is so important. I can't even tell you how exciting this was when I found it. But it is the only database that does that. And searching Prospero directly is horrible. I'm a librarian and and I do advanced searching all the time. And I swear, when I'm searching for my own reviews that I know the titles of in Prospero, half the time I can't even get them to come up. So being able to search this on a third party is amazing. That website again is Trip. And here at Yale, we have Trip Pro, so you have a little more access. So I would recommend that you review it on the VPN just so you have those additional access. But it is a free database. So even if you're not at Yale or you're no longer at Yale in the future, it's still going to be available to you. And that's going to allow you to search all of the Prospero registries, look to see if you can find a registry for the topic or a similar topic that you have going on. Next, you might want to do just a generic Google search with your topic and review protocol as the search strategy. You might want to go to Open Science Framework directly, and then like I said in that previous search, we would have captured those protocol papers. Another important part of this process, and I generally recommend doing this as the same time you're checking off these boxes, and I'm calling this like the is it feasible to do this project, right? So this should be your starting point. Preliminary search to see other review articles, looking to see at the protocols, and then identifying validating articles. Now, this is important for when you start your search, but if you're doing it now, you know that the project is feasible, right? So you have studies you plan on including. So you want to take your inclusion exclusion criteria. So why we would start with that as the process. And we want to find 3 to 5 key studies that you would include. Now, I'm going to really recommend something crazy here, but I recommend that you start at Google Scholar. This is going to allow you to search the full text of the articles rather than just the index fields. Find the studies that you would include. And so once we have these, and again, so important that we're including these. So, if it's a so you're doing a systematic review, we do not want systematic review publications. If you send me a validating article that's a systematic review, we don't want that because that paper is not going to be included, right? It's not including original research. It's synthesizing data. So we can't include that because if we included all of the studies that meet their criteria, then we're double stating all of the findings because the findings that were included are going to get double counted. So for systematic reviews, we're only including articles that are original research. So that's an important part of your inclusion exclusion criteria. So these studies should be original articles that meet your inclusion exclusion criteria. Obviously, if you're doing a scoping review that has some element of a bibliometric analysis, you may include review papers. That is a much larger topic that I am not going to touch upon here. So definitely check out some of my other videos where we talk about, when you might include reviews and scoping reviews. But anyways, 3 to 5 articles. We're going to save these. They might be super helpful when you're writing your introduction and your rationale. But we're saving these because we're going to test that our search strategy brings these articles in. And so if the search strategy doesn't bring these articles in, that's really problematic. And we have to review the search strategy because we might be missing stuff. But if it does, we've checked the box that we're at least getting the ones that we quickly identified. Okay, so we looked for protocols and what happens if you found, and reviews, and what happens if you found a relevant protocol or a review, right? So there's already something on this topic. That doesn't automatically mean the answer is this project shouldn't go forward. You really want to ask yourself some questions. What is the timing of the existing material? Is it published 5 years ago and there's been 6 different studies that may have changed the original recommendation? Obviously, that means that it's time to do an update. And if the team hasn't registered a protocol and saying that they're doing an update, you could be that person that does the important update. Again, we want to make sure that there's enough new evidence that the review is adding something to the literature and will be novel and important and timely. Obviously, talk to your PI, or if you are the PI, you're the subject content expert, think about your field. Is this something that's necessary? Really important. I cannot stress this enough. These are very time consuming. projects. And so you don't want to undertake it if it's going to be something that is not used or very difficult to publish. Next, we want to think about the place that it was published and the quality or the methodology that was done in this review. Is it high quality, well conducted? Do you see flaws? Is there missing studies? Those are all things you want to consider when considering making a secondary review on a topic. Um, I'm hoping to record a video talking about how to assess the quality of reviews. That should be forthcoming in the future. So, depending on when you're watching this, please feel free to check my YouTube video and see if I have additional educational material on that. So hopefully I can help you assess that soon. But in the meantime, feel free to reach out to the librarians. We can definitely help you assess the quality of the review or provide you a tool that can do that, like Amstar 2. Next, you want to look at, do the methods reflect the specific criteria of the interest of your research question? So for instance, is your inclusion exclusion criteria the same? So if a review, you're looking at a relevant review, but you go in and you're like, oh, they didn't include adolescents. This is a disease that impacts children and adolescents significantly. You may decide that you want to redo it. Now, whether or not you want to go back to your protocol and rescope and say, I'm only looking at or this might be before you do your protocol, so you haven't written it, so you're just thinking it. I want to look at only children and adolescents. Maybe you're only thinking about adolescents. Maybe you're like, I want to compare all of them. Alternatively, you can publish your systematic review, and then you could do an umbrella review, which is a review of reviews where you take the two and synthesize between the two studies. So if you don't want to look at all those adult papers, you don't have to. So there's a lot of methodological things we can do here. So again, talk to your librarian. We're happy to discuss these with you. Okay. Then, you want to think about if there's a specific gap between your research question and the existing protocol and manuscript. Alternative, like I mentioned earlier, maybe they're recruiting people and they still need researchers to help with this question. I would probably reach out and see where they are, if they need help, if they're interested in collaborating. It could, help you develop a new working research relationship that ends up being very fruitful in the future. Okay, so another really important thing to think about is your actual protocol versus the registration. And so I know I've given these definitions a few times. I'm going to just do it one more time so that way I make sure everyone understands the difference. A protocol is a detailed plan describing the review objectives, methods, and analysis before you've started the review. The purpose is to ensure transparency, reproducibility, and methodological rigor. Alternatively, the registration of your protocol is publicly recording your protocol in the registry before the beginning of the review, or like I said, before data extraction. The purpose is to establish transparency, credibility. We're also hoping to kind of reduce duplication, research time waste. It provides a time-stamped record of planned methods. So if you write a protocol and you don't register it, that's problematic. If you register nothing, the peer reviewers are going to look at it and be like, where's the protocol? These are two separate concepts. They're very tightly woven together, and it's important to do both. Okay, so where to publish your protocol? There's many different places, and there's no right or wrong answer for this. It just depends on what the research team is doing, their preferences, and how they plan on moving forward. So if you're a med student and or a resident or a postdoc, someone that's really trying to get publications to apply for training or something else, or an assistant professor going up for professorship, and you're like, oh my goodness, I need a publication in a year or X amount of time. Again, evidence synthesis is a really time consuming process. I just don't want to understate that at all. So this is not a fast research protocol or methodology. But if you need a publication, and I do not support just publishing things to publish things, but let's be realistic in the world that we live in. There are peer-reviewed journals that publish protocols. There are also protocol-specific journals and platforms that will publish protocols. Now, I want to add a caveat to this that most journals that are publishing protocol papers, so that's no results section, just your introduction, your methods, and a discussion of why it's important, what's going on, etc. Most of these are open access journals that have an article processing charge. So I also have found in working in this that most of the time reviews do not have grant funding. And so if you don't have a way to pay these protocols, I do also recommend that you reach out to or look at the Yale APC waiver and discount page, because we might be able to get you a slight discount or a complete waiver of the APC charge, depending on the journal. But just like important to note that there normally is an article processing charge. I will also say these publications often do not get a lot of citations. So how hopeful are these on your CV is something that you'll want to weigh. But it's published in a journal. It will probably be seen by more people, so that's the benefit to this. So I'm not discouraging you. I just want everyone to be realistic. They're also a little more time consuming. So you'll want to add in a little more time in terms of the writing, editing, getting back from peer review, all of that good stuff, because it can be a bit more time consuming versus the protocol you're writing for yourself can be a little more precise, no word counts, etc. Okay, so that's journals. We have other options though. So registries. It's important to note that these are not full publications, but public records. So it's important to think of them this way. And I say this particularly because Prospero, like I said, in that update, they did add this caveat that they are not a publication, they are a registry. And so their template does not include all of the information that you should be including. And they are highly encouraging, or in my humble opinion, they're kind of guilting you into it, which is a good thing. They're guilting you into uploading your full protocol. So highly recommend, if you're working with Prospero, to upload the full protocol. There are other registries like Open Science Framework, Protocol.io. There's other ones. There's the ones that are free and for cost. So you definitely want to compare these sites and find the one that meets your needs. You might also want to look at more discipline-specific registries rather than generic ones like Open Science Framework. Prospero, I will also say, they do not publish scoping reviews. They only publish systematic review protocols in health. They do accept rapid reviews and umbrella reviews within that grouping, but based on the changes on their website, I don't know if that's going to continue. But historically, they have accepted those. So if you're doing a scoping review, I recommend Open Science Framework, but definitely check out different places. I just like Open Science Framework because they're fast. It's a very quick process, and then it's also free, and that checks my two boxes. But you may have other wants and needs in your registry. The other option is to create a protocol paper, so similar that you would publish in a peer-reviewed journal or protocol-specific journal or platform, and publish it on a preprint server, an open science framework platform. So this could be OSF preprints or like medRxiv, bioRxiv. So you want to think if that is something that would work better for you. The benefits, it's faster. Anything in medRxiv is also added to PubMed Central, so or PubMed, so it will be findable, which is nice. Okay. So we have given you lots of building blocks, and let's put this all together. Protocols are your research roadmap. It is essential. I can't get around this enough. This is a required part of the process, and it is very important to do and to take seriously and, do well. It doesn't have to be a really time-consuming process, but it does need to be carefully thought out and reviewed by the key research team stakeholders. It is essential for team coordination to reduce bias, enhancing reproducibility and transparency. And like I mentioned, it is required to meet most journal author guidelines and funding requirements. So if you have a grant funder or if you want to get it published, you need a protocol. And it's really important that you write it early and then register it at a time that's appropriate. Okay, our key takeaways, and I'm so sorry. I know I'm hitting the nail on this one. Protocols are non-negotiable for credible evidence synthesis projects. Systematic and scoping review protocols differ in scope, but they have a very similar structure, similar to how, their review types work in their full text when they're completed. Registration improves transparency and impact. It also makes it findable and could help you find collaborators that are interested in your research. You want to start drafting early and you don't want to wait until after the search. We definitely need that inclusion and exclusion criteria before the search strategy is fully developed. Okay, so this is a recording, so no questions. But if you are a Yale affiliate and you're watching this and you want to talk to me about your protocol, please feel free to email me, email here. You can also reach out to your research and education librarian, and they can help you through all of this stuff too. If you need anything, just let me know. Everyone have a very nice evening.